Welcome. I'm so thrilled to have so many guests here today. Doesn't my grave look spiffy? The headstone I share with my namesake niece Jenny was recently reset, so we are ready for company. It is also a pleasure to have my lovely adopted daughter Opal here today.
Yes, it's so nice to be in Algona again after all these years. I'm actually buried in Toronto, Canada, but I wanted to join Mother here today to help tell our story.
I was born in eastern Iowa in 1868, the ninth of 13 children born to Thomas and Mary Carey. My older brother Frank and his wife Ava, they moved to Algona in the 1880s. When I was 16 years old, my sister Margaret died in childbirth. When Frank and Ava came to the funeral and saw how upset I was, they suggested I come back to Algona for a while. A while turned out to be the rest of my life. I met my husband, Ari Vanderland, here in Algona. Ari was born in Holland and immigrated to the United States when he was 18. He was a fine carpenter, and during his lifetime he built 17 homes and bungalows in the 3rd Ward District of Algona. They were simple homes for a quickly growing Algona.
Now, not like those fancy houses over on Thornton Street where the rich and famous live. I sure would have liked to have grown up in one of those houses. I too was born in eastern Iowa, the youngest of 6 children born to Edward and Ina Carey. When I was 3 years old, my mother died after falling from a buggy and hitting her head. When Jenny, Aunt Eva, and Uncle Frank came to the funeral and saw how worried my father was at the thought of trying to care for all of us on his own, Aunt Jenny suggested I come to Algona and stay with her and Ari for a while. A while turned out to be a permanent thing because just a few years later, my dad passed away.
Ari and I never had any children of our own, but we loved you just as if you were our own daughter. Our lives were very busy. We were active in the Swedish Lutheran Church and local politics, even holding the Republican caucus for the 3rd Ward in our home. Ari's construction business continued to grow, and in 1910 he formed a partnership with DeLoss Clapsaddle to build a concrete block factory.
We had met DeLoss in 1902, shortly after he came to live in Algona. He bought the lots next to the house where we were living, and our family became good friends. In 1905, his wife Mary died, leaving him with 3 sons. The youngest, Horace, was only 5 years old at the time. Horace and I had that sad common bond of losing our mothers at a young age.
Do you remember the time Ari and DeLoss brought home that human skull and other bones that they found while excavating sand for the concrete blocks?
Do I ever? It scared the bejeebers out of us. I also remember that they sold the concrete blocks for 10 cents each. The 10 cents helped to pay for the piano lessons I was taking from Professor Benjamin.
Speaking of Professor Benjamin, do you remember when I wrote you years later to tell how he had bludgeoned his wife to death?
Yes, I do. I was shocked. Oh, let's get away from gruesome murders. Do you remember the summer we canned 50 quarts of strawberries from our garden? The strawberries love that sandy soil.
I sure do. I had to run down to Sorensen's corner grocery store for more sugar. You were supposed to make sure that the pot didn't boil over, but you snuck out to have a cigarette.
Looking back, I realize now that I was a handful, but I didn't always deserve the level of punishment I got. My attitude became more defiant as time went by. It all came to a head later that summer of 1913 when I was 16. I went out one evening and kept company with a man until 6 a.m. When I tried to sneak back into the house, Ari was waiting and gave me a whipping. He believed in the biblical teaching, spare the rod, spoil the child.
A few days later you disappeared. We suspected you might have eloped with the man you'd been out all night with. But the sheriff tracked him down in Minnesota and you weren't with him.
I was actually down in Des Moines. I looked older than my 16 years and I was sure that I could pass as an adult and get a job. And I did. I got a job as a domestic in a private home. I spent a quiet 3 weeks there. Well, until my photo appeared on the front page of the Des Moines Register and the police came home.
Ari went to Des Moines to get you, and we tried to put the whole thing behind us.
Yes, when I had a daughter of my own, I realized how much grief I had put you through. let's talk about happier times. Do you remember when you were the spokesperson for Doan's Pills?
Indeed I do. I suffered from back pain, dizzy spells, and headaches. Miller's drugstore suggested I try Doan's kidney pills. They made such a difference. When Miller's asked for my testimonial, I was happy to give it, and the ad ran in the Algona newspapers for years. The extra income went towards paying for your piano. Ari was more than willing to pay for your piano lessons, but he drew the line at buying a piano.
You know, he would never admit it, but Ari enjoyed the sound of music filling our house. But he didn't appreciate it when little Horace would bang on the keys, though. That sent us all reaching for the Doan's Pills to get rid of our headaches.
I have some Doan's pills with me now if anyone needs some. I sure went through a lot of these when you were a wild and crazy teenager.
I guess I was pretty wild. To further help relieve the tension in our house the summer after I ran away, I went to Grand Forks, North Dakota to live with Aunt Winnie. I got a job as a pianist at the Grand Theater. Just when my life seemed to be going well, Aunt Winnie got sick and died. I came back to Algona and got a job at the meat market as a cashier and a bookkeeper. But my wanderlust reared its head again, and the next thing anyone knew, I was off to Montana to visit my natural sister, Hetty May. There I met a handsome Canadian named Harry Barnum. We had a whirlwind courtship, got married, and headed to California to live.
You were better off in California, as things were tense at home between Ari and me. In fact, things were tense all over the world. The Great War, what they now call World War I, was being fought in Europe. Not so little anymore, Horace was fighting over in France. DeLos's two other sons were medics stateside, tending to the returning soldiers. I began to attend services at the Catholic Church, trying to make sense of the world in chaos. But Ari was adamantly opposed to me going to St. Cecilia. To make matters even worse, in 1918 I became seriously ill with the Spanish flu. Ari refused to take care of me. Thankfully, Aunt Eva realized what was going on between us and took me into her home. It was while I was so sick that I got that telegram from the Red Cross telling me that your husband had died and that you and my 6-month-old granddaughter were desperately ill and not expected to survive.
Yes, Mom, those were dark times for all of us. Somehow I gathered together the strength to get little Anita and myself up to Toronto to be near Harry's parents. They were devastated by the death of their son and took little Anita into their home while I tried to figure out what to do with my life.
It was best you were in Canada, as things continued to be tense between Ari and me. Ari refused to let me return home or support me unless I signed an affidavit stating that I would abandon my Catholic faith. He even rebuffed my attempts to enter our home to retrieve my clothing and personal items. But Aunt Eva, she went down to the local Cradle store and bought me clothes, and she charged them all to Ari. But of course he refused to pay. DeLos's son, Dr. Guy Clapsaddle up in Berthoud, he sued Ari for the 56 days of medical care that he provided me while I was staying at Frank and Ava's, and for all those charges at the Cradle store. The court ordered him $280.
I'll bet Ari was annoyed when he got slapped with that $280 bill. He was such a tightwad with money.
Probably not as annoyed as when I filed for divorce and got the house in the divorce settlement that he had locked me out of when I had the Spanish flu. Speaking of the Cradle store, some of my fondest memories of you growing up is when we would go buy fabric to make new dresses for the school year. Can you believe we could find fabric for just 7 cents a yard back then?
We had great times sewing together. You were such a good seamstress and a great letter writer, too. I couldn't believe it when you wrote to tell me that Ari remarried 11 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and that he and his new wife were living 3 doors down from you in another one of the 17 houses he had built.
It was okay. It gave DeLos and me time to get to know each other without Ari in the picture. DeLos had moved back out to the Plum Creek farm that he had purchased in 1901. Horace was safely home from the Great War, and I conveniently moved in with them as their housekeeper.
Mother, how scandalous. You're the bee's knees.
Yes, but things were nice and quiet for us out at the farm. But then Horace got married, and he and his new bride wanted to live in the farm. So Delos and I moved back into town. You know the house 3 doors down from Ari and his new wife? Delos and I never got married, which seemed to get some tongues wagging around Algona.
I'll bet it did. I choked on my morning coffee when I read your letter in 1932 saying you were suing Theodore Getters for $5,000 for slander. Then your next letter included a newspaper clipping telling how Ari had had a vision revealing where the kidnapped Lindbergh baby could be found, and that he'd actually written the Lindberghs a letter. At that point, I knew I had to make a long overdue trip to Algona to see for myself what was going on. Say, what was it that Getters said about you? Horse feathers! I'd have sued him for $10,000. I'm glad I came back again the next year for your birthday. Both times I brought my Canadian friend Herbert Lamb with me. 2 months after my 1933 visit, Ari died. I couldn't believe it when you sent me his obituary and it said he had suffered a nervous breakdown 5 weeks prior. Who writes that kind of stuff in an obituary?
Everything was printed in the newspaper back then. Hey, why didn't you and your friend Herb ever get married?
Why didn't you and Delos ever get married?
Okay, you got me there. Delos and I made a really good pair. I suffered from diabetes, and as my health began to fail, he made sure that all my needs were met. When I passed away in 1940, at age 73, I was buried here with your Uncle Frank and Aunt Eva, and next to their daughter and my namesake, Jenny Shuey. Jenny had died 20 years earlier following a goiter operation, but her grave never had a marker, and that always bothered me. So Delos purchased a gravestone for the 2 of us.
And I lived happily in the Toronto area the rest of my life, dying in February of 1989 at 92. My daughter Anita died 4 years later in 1993.
In closing, I want to thank you all for coming here today. I especially want to thank Opal for coming all the way from Toronto to help me tell our story. We have so much more to get caught up on. Let's go out to the Four Corners and have a cup of coffee at Wahlberg's.
Well, didn't you say Wahlberg's became Van's Cafe?
Yeah, but it'll always be Wahlberg's to me.
Very good.
Any questions?
Where's the lost?
He's buried in Illinois. Horace is out in East Lawn.
Okay.
And Ari is buried in Illinois too, at his second wife's home.
So which street were the 3 houses on?
Worcester and the corner of Lucas and Worcester.
And they're still there.
They're still there.
They look a little different.
walk.
Yeah.
Before we begin, seriously, I want you to raise your hand if you can't hear me, because there's no point in coming here and listening to a story if you can't hear the story. So
She's going to use her playground voice.
yeah,
We can hear it now. I can hear it now.
I'm so glad that you've come out tonight, and I'm so grateful that the weather has been nice for it tonight. So, my name is Edith Call Hutchison. I'm the second child of Ambrose and Nancy Henderson Call, who I'm sure you all know. Ambrose was one of the founders of Algona. My husband Archie Hutchison and I are really buried way down the hill there. And rather than have you walk all the way down there to their gravestone, we decided to come up here. But if you'd like to walk down there later, they're buried down there. She and her husband and a couple of their children are buried down there too, so you can see their stones. There is a flag. There's a flag down there to help you find it too. But to save those steps, we have chosen to stand by the grave here of John Haggard. It seems only appropriate for us to be by his stone, because he is going to play an important part in the story I'm going to tell you tonight. Although you are going to learn a little bit about my life and that of my family, this really is the story of a family treasure known as Ida's cradle. As you might know, my father came here with his older brother Asa in 1854 and founded the city of Algona. My mother came to Algona the first time in 1856, along with her father, Hezekiah Henderson, who built the first primitive hotel in the city, which stood where the business office of Algona Municipal Utilities now stands, which you probably all know where that site is. My mother was only 12 years old at the time. The Hendersons did not remain in Algona for long. Her father and the rest of the family went west, while Mother returned to Charleston, Illinois to live with her maternal grandparents and go to school there. She returned to Algona, however, at the age of 16, and she and my father were married shortly thereafter. So, quite young when she was married. During his bachelor days, my father had lived either in his own log cabin in what is now today known as A.A. Call State Park, or he lived with his sister, Mary Blackford, and her family. He now set about building a home for his new bride on land that he owned overlooking the Des Moines River at the corner of what is now known as Hall and College Streets. Can you picture that in your mind? It's like on the way out to Call Park and College Street. I think you'll have to refresh my memory. Is that where the Good Samaritan was? And
Yeah, that's
okay.
where the condos are.
Yeah, where the condos are now. Yeah, so that was their home there. It would be constructed from board lumber straight from the local sawmill. It was 2 stories tall with a small front porch. Eventually, 1-story wings were added on either side as the family grew and more room was needed. Florence was the firstborn in the family, arriving in August of 1861. The poor girl did not even have a bed to call her own. In those days, most furniture that was not hauled into the settlement by wagon had to be handcrafted locally. They obviously made do with what they had for one child, but when my parents knew that I was on the way, they were determined to provide a cradle for me. With 2 small children, Mother definitely needed not only a safe place for me to sleep, but a way that she could rock the fussy baby while she was tending to other things. My parents sold a load of firewood and used the money to hire a man named Orange Minkler and his ox team to fell a walnut tree in their timber and haul it to the John Haggard home. John Haggard. Grandpa Haggard, as he was affectionately known by everyone in the community, created a cradle from that walnut tree, employing his skills as a cabinet maker. Likely using a treadle-driven lathe, he fashioned spindles and finials and smooth, even rockers. When I arrived in February of 1864, the cradle was all ready for me. Mother had constructed a soft mattress and knitted blankets which kept me snug and warm on the cold winter days that followed. I was fondly called Ida. Even though my name was Edith, I was called Ida, perhaps because it was easier for my 2.5-year-old sister, Florence, to pronounce. Then Sister Etta would be the next one to use the cradle. She was born almost 2 years after me, in January of 1866. But in the early morning hours of Tuesday, February 11th, 1868, Etta was in the cradle watching Mother prepare breakfast for the family. Around 7 o'clock, flames were suddenly discovered on the roof and garret above the kitchen. My stunned father began yelling, "Fire!" with all his might and rushed outside to grab a ladder to use to fight the blaze. Neighbors and townspeople came running with buckets in hand to help. In all the excitement, Mother suddenly remembered Etta was still in the cradle. She quickly seized the little girl, and as she turned to leave, flaming fragments of the kitchen ceiling crashed down, landing right on top of the cradle where Etta had just been. At that moment, Louis Smith burst into the room, and assessing the situation, he quickly hurled the burning blankets from the cradle, which he then carried outside and threw in a snowbank. It was there that Father found the cradle rocking in a winter wind. Although most of the household goods were saved, the house itself was a total loss. My parents received an insurance payment of $860.80 from Hartford Insurance Company. They used the funds to rebuild a house very similar to the one that they had lost. We were thankful that the cradle had survived without much damage, as it would soon be needed to rock our sister Bertha, who would arrive just 3 short months later. Bertie was a happy baby who gleefully giggled and laughed, especially at her disappointed father, who had wanted a son. She would light up when Father entered the room and begged to be picked up from the cradle. She loved to sit on his lap and pull on his beard. It wasn't long before she had him wrapped around her little finger. Well, she occupied the cradle until Ambrose Glenn was born in August of 1870. Although Father and Mother were overjoyed to have a son, his older sisters were thrilled as well. We all spent time rocking little Glenn in the cradle and singing lullabies to him. He was a strong and happy little boy, but he was suddenly taken ill when he was 2.5 years old and died 2 days later. A pall settled over the home. The cradle was banished to the parlor bedroom, out of sight. Sitting in silence, unwanted, it was as if the cradle grieved along with us. This time, 3 years would pass before it would be resurrected from its hiding place, and that was when our brother Chester was born. All of the broken hearts that grieved for little Glenn were now filled to overflowing in thanksgiving for the gift of Chester. The cradle itself seemed to rock with more purpose than in the past, joyfully soothing the little babe it held. There was one more surprise for the family and for the cradle. On May 17, 1879, twins, Roscoe and Myrtle, were born, thereby completing the family of Ambrose and Nancy. The twins often shared the cradle, and their weight and movement caused the cradle to rock on its own, which Mother declared was very uncanny. Once the twins outgrew the cradle, it was moved to the attic of the new spacious mansion which my parents built in 1886. There it would sit quietly, waiting for a chance to be of service again. When grandchildren arrived, the cradle was dusted off and began its travels, staying briefly at each house where new babies resided. The children of Florence and Etta were the first ones to use the cradle. My family came later, as I stayed single for a long time. In fact, my parents were somewhat fearful that I would be an old maid. I was busy going to college and then teaching school, for a brief time in country school, but then in our local school system. I met Archie Hutchison soon after his arrival in Algona. He charmed me with his Irish brogue and sparkling eyes, and we were married in 1893 when I was 29 years old. Our first son, Homer, was born in October of 1894, but he died 7 months later while we were living in Louisiana, leaving us heartbroken. So we soon returned to Algona to be near our family. When our daughter Dorothy was born, we claimed the cradle. Then soon followed Donald, Isabel, and Theodore, making 18 babies who had been lulled to sleep in that cradle. The well-traveled cradle had more babies to serve when the children of Bertha, Myrtle, and Roscoe took their turns. As that generation outgrew the need for the cradle, it eventually was returned to me and relegated to my attic. Medical science was now claiming that rocking was no longer good for babies, making old-fashioned cradles obsolete. The cradle must have felt safe in my possession, as I often heard the sounds of rocking coming from my attic. In 1944, in honor of my 80th birthday, my sister Florence wrote a poem entitled Ida's Cradle, chronicling its history. It was so well done that it was included in later printings of her book, Early Algona, which she wrote for the Diamond Jubilee celebration in 1929. How many of you have read Early Algona? Some of you, good. Well, Ida's Cradle is a poem that's in the back of that book. After my 80th birthday, I lived another 9 years before passing away in March of 1953. I had been alone since Archie's death in 1938, and I missed him terribly. As for the cradle, it continued its travels, ending up in Myrtle's family, being passed down through generations. It has survived, but has definitely changed in appearance. The rockers are gone, most likely thanks to the idea that rocking babies could cause them harm, as are the decorative finials that adorn the 4 bedposts. But for all its wear and tear, it remains as sturdy as the solid walnut tree from which it came. The cradle made its final trip just recently to its permanent home at the Kossuth County Historical Museum. In fact, you can see it at the museum this weekend if you go up there, along with a baby bonnet that I wore when I was little. I am grateful to Myrtle's great-granddaughter, whose name is Julie Dickinson Davies, who so generously donated the cradle and arranged for its shipping all the way from Pennsylvania to Algona, and to her cousin, Molly McComb Skold, who donated the bonnet and other call photos and memorabilia. Ida's cradle, with all its memories, has come home to stay. And if you would be interested in purchasing a copy of the book Early Algona, which contains the poem Ida's Cradle, they will be up at the museum too, and you can buy one there. So, thank you for coming to hear my story.
So we are very glad that you could be here with us tonight by Eleanor's tomb. And isn't this a lovely crowd for our tour?
Yeah, it really is. You know, Algona I've always found to be a very warm and welcoming place, and very interested in arts and education. And that's why no matter where I've lived in this United States, I've always considered Algona to be my second home. I just wish I had a cigarette and a drink right now. But I suppose we ought to introduce ourselves. I am Eleanor Haggard Toogood. I'm the oldest of the 3 children of Melzer and Elizabeth Dyes Haggard. And Barbara, my sister, is the youngest of us 3, and then we had her brother John, who was 13 years older than Barbara.
We 3 children lived at 439 North Thornton. And right across the street from us was our uncle, J.W. Haggard. And then if you crossed the street and went a little bit south, our Aunt Mattie and Uncle Albert Falkenhanger lived in the house that's still standing, and so is ours. And a little bit further on lived our grandparents, Susie and David Haggard. And that house is no longer on Thornton Street. But I didn't ever know my aunt, or my grandma, Susan, because she died 3 years before I was born. But grandfather David lived a long and very active life in Algona. The street we lived on was full of Haggards when we were growing up.
And if you'd like a more detailed account of the Haggard family, you can read it in this little tract that Manita Murphy wrote last year. And it's at the Algona Public Library in the genealogy room, where one wall of shelves is in memorial of Barbara. Congratulations, Barbara.
Thank you. Suffice it to say that our grandfather David came into Kossuth County when he was only 15 years old. And he was with a surveying crew that his father had put together. he saw his first bison, his first elk. He met some Native Americans, and he also noted the very rich black soil as they were struggling through the swampy land.
Our abridged version is that our grandfather David returned to his hometown of Dubuque. And when he was there, he met his wife, Susie Wilmot, which wasn't his wife. He met her, and then one day the Civil War broke out, and the next day they got married, and the third day he went off to war. So, you know, he was a little bit impulsive, Barbara, and sort of like I am. But they returned, after the war, they returned to Algona area, and they built a sod house where most of their 5 children were born, and that sod house was in Irvington Township, which is now the Sherman Township. And they moved into Algona when our grandfather David was elected to be the sheriff of Kossuth County. And then he was also elected to become the mayor, and he was involved in many, many civic organizations.
But we have heard that you are interested in us and also in the Haggard Too Good Trust. And so I asked Eleanor to help me tell this story.
Well, one of the most important foundations was that our grandfather David, upon the graduation of his 5 children, he gave each one of them $1,000. Now think about $1,000 at the end of 1800s, and each of their children, the women and the men, all graduated high school in the 1800s. That's pretty amazing. My father took his $1,000 and moved to Milwaukee to go to a business school. And there he met Elizabeth Dyes from New York. Upon their graduation, they returned to Algona, and he was involved in real estate, and then he also formed the Haggard Peak Abstracts. Their office, some of you may know, was right by the old Opera House on Courthouse Square. And he also helped his brother-in-law, Albert Falkenheimer, to start the Druggist, which is now the Pharmacist Mutual Insurance Company.
Our father Melzer was also interested in a lot of civic affairs, and he belonged to many organizations. And one of the things that he did when he was young was that he was in the National Guard.
Then he also gave each of his grandchildren $500 upon their graduation. So I took my $500 when I talked to my parents about it, and I went to the Ward Belmont College in Nashville, Tennessee. And I chose it because it wasn't just a finishing school. It was a school for intellectual and social development and for lives of purpose. My life was of purpose. And I liked Nashville too. I mean, it was really different than Algona.
I know, but I was lonesome for my big sister. And so I was really glad when you transferred to the University of Iowa, and that was a lot closer to Algona.
Well, our brother, John, was there, and so I decided I might as well come back to Iowa. But when I got there, I met Forrest Toogood, and who wouldn't be swept off their feet by this handsome, great athlete? So we eloped, and I never finished college. And on we went to follow his baseball career, and I made many houses a home. And he was playing for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he played for the Cleveland Indians, which are now the Cleveland Guardians. And he even roomed with Dizzy Dean, which was a famous Cardinal pitcher, as you may know.
Mm-hmm. And we loved having them come to Algona in the off season. But it must have been a tough life for you in some ways.
Well, it wasn't easy because Toogie, as we called him, only got paid 6 months out of the year. The good part is that his coach, Branch Rickey, took him under his wing, and he was his chauffeur as they drove around scouting minor league teams. And so Toogie got to pick the brain of one of the best coaches at that time.
And here in Algona, he was a great golfer. And he loved to tell stories at the country club. He was a great storyteller. And Eleanor was the life of any party that we had. And I played the piano. So, but then it happened that Toogie injured his pitching arm, and that ended his 8-year minor league baseball career. So what were they going to do except that the University of Idaho called? And Toogie and Eleanor went out there and he coached baseball and basketball.
But then World War II happened, and he became a naval officer. And after he returned from the war, he finished out his career at the University of Southern California as the basketball coach and then as an assistant athletic director. Now, I loved his basketball coaching because I got to sit behind him at every game, and there were lots of celebrities that came, and so that was a lot of fun for me. And you can read more about his career in Maury White's article in the Des Moines Register's Sports Hall of Fame. But, you know, to say he was a good coach is an understatement. And he was a wonderful man, and I missed him every day after he died in 1972.
But while you were at USC, you were also involved in a way in sports because you became one of the board of directors for the USC Women's Collegiate Sports. And then we both were very proud of our much younger and still living cousin Judy Thorson when she was a director of the Iowa High School Girls Athletic Union.
Yes, we are proud of her. But, I think now it's time to hear about you, Barbara.
Well, yes. I did. I also was following my sister at Ward Belmont College. She was one of my influences in going there, but there was also a music conservatory program that was 2 years. And that enabled me then to go on to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and graduate with a degree in music education. I taught in Battle Creek, Michigan, and then in Eagle Grove, and then, let's face it, I really didn't enjoy teaching. So I came back to Algona.
Well, and our parents weren't getting any younger either.
No, that's true, but I really couldn't just stay at home. So I decided to apply for a job with Russ Buchanan, who also had been in high school when I was there, and was just a fledgling young lawyer at that time. So it was a part-time job. I was his secretary. And then at the same time, I applied for a job at the Algona Public Library. Kitty Phillips was the director. I'm looking around, I'm not sure how many of you even, yes, there are a few, yes, who knew Kitty, and I was her assistant director. I also was very involved in community concert. I made sure every year I was on the selection committee, and I also sold tickets for 30 years. And I worked at the library from the 40s through 1980. At the same time, I was instrumental in starting League of Women Voters in Algona and also the United Way.
You were very busy, Barbara, in the community. You probably now want to know, how did this trust get started?
Wait a minute, I want to talk about my one term on
That's City Council, that's right.
Yes.
I forgot about that. That you were a busy woman.
I was such a busy woman. I served one term only on the city council.
But the first woman.
It was the first woman, yeah. And that was fine, but I also was very proud of the fact that Algona High School, a National Honor Society, made me an honorary member. There was no National Honor Society when I was in high school, so that was really important to me. And I also transcribed books for the into Braille for the Iowa Commission on the Blind. Now you can imagine that my piano playing skills came in very handy for that job. But now we should move on. You're right.
I think so, Barbara, unless there's anything more you want to say about yourself.
How about myself?
So anyway, the Haggard Too Good Trust, we decided, we looked around and saw that I had no children, you had no children, John had no children, and so we knew that the family tree was withering.
In 1981, Barbara, me, and my sister Eleanor started thinking about the fact that we really wanted the Haggard name to continue. And we were interested in many things about the community. We had 240 acres of land, and so we knew that that could be the basis of a trust. And we were interested in the Historical Society, and the arts, and in several other things that we thought would be important for our community to continue, especially music programs that can be brought in and art in a civic place. So as we were thinking about that, Eleanor then died in 1986. And Russ Buchanan had already started working with us on a trust because by then he was our lawyer, and he also was a personal friend, and he knew a lot about trusts. I died in 1996, and at that time, our land was worth $750,000. So that was the basis for our trust. And Russ said that probably the two trusts that he was most proud of were the Point Trust and the Haggard Too Good Trust, because of all the things that it brings to our home. So the first directors were Teresa Leish, Russell Buchanan, Paul Wigley, and Judy Thorson and her husband Richard.
And one of the first exhibits that was brought here was the Iowa Artists Traveling exhibit that was sponsored by the Brunier Museum of Iowa State University. And since then, the trust has brought many different performers and performances here to Algona. And some of you may have gone to the Nutcracker in December, and that was one of the Haggard Too Good charitable sponsors. And we also sponsor this Voices from the Past. And we sponsored it since 2012, except in 2020 when, of course, nothing was sponsored. So we're very, very proud of our trust, and we think that it has really been one of the jewels of this community.
And so we thank you for coming tonight to get to know us a little better and to know a little bit more about the Haggard Too Good Trust. Good.
Barbara, when did you serve on the council?
That's a good question, and I don't remember. I'm so
We'll have to
sorry.
find that out.
It was in the 50s. I'll say that.
Oh, it's in
Well, good evening, and welcome to our final resting place. This is my husband Joseph, and I'm Helen Paxton.
By all means, make yourselves comfortable while we tell you our story. Probably the most romantic you'll hear today. I was born in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, April 13th, 1856. But I was still in my teens when I left my home and went west looking for a successful life. I succeeded in that and so much more.
My father, Dana D. Dodge, came from Vermont, and my mother from New York. They met and married in Aurora, Illinois, where they lived when I was born, April 21st, 1859. Later, my family moved just across the border to Janesville, Wisconsin. Father enlisted in Company D, 2nd Wisconsin Infantry, as a second lieutenant during the Civil War. later rising to the rank of captain. During the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861, he suffered from sunstroke and had to resign his commission. In 1862, when I was 3, we moved to Minneapolis, where we all eventually met Joseph. He was a fine, earnest young man and such a good dancer.
When Helen's parents decided to try their luck in Irvington, Iowa in early 1876, I missed Helen's beautiful face and charming ways so much that I boarded a train and arrived in Algona on St. Patrick's Day in a snowstorm. With that kind of tenacity, it convinced Helen's parents that I was a suitable mate for her. We were married on July 4th of that year when Helen was just 17 and I was 20. Two brave young people facing the world together.
We set up farming in the Riverdale Township of Kossuth County, and 3 children were soon added to our family: Elwood, Dana, and Catherine. It was a strenuous life, with Joseph having grain to plant and harvest, plus a cattle herd, and me raising 3 children, chickens, and a large garden. We had good neighbors, and my parents were not too far away, so there was lots of cooperation, especially with baling hay and the harvest in the fall. During the summers when the crops were in, we found time to roll up the carpet and host dances while the children slept in rows on our beds. In the winters, we would hitch our team to a sleigh when the snow was just right and go to the neighbors for an evening of singing or card playing.
I made time to become part of the Kossuth County Agriculture Committee, which organized the Kossuth County Fair. During my time as director from Riverdale, we added more exhibit classes, built a poultry building, and added 6 acres to the size of the fairgrounds. I was superintendent of the horse show and served on other committees.
In 1903, when Joe was 47, we decided to move our family to Algona. It was a good year for farmers, so this was the right time. Joe was very interested in insurance and making sure that farmers were protected, especially from fires. He became associated with the Kossuth County Mutual Fire Association, later Kossuth Mutual Insurance. Ed Blackford was his secretary and Joe served as his assistant. Later, when Mr. Blackford retired, Joe became the secretary. Part of his job was as an adjuster, and he had a reputation as a fair and trustworthy business person. Since the company only sold fire and lightning insurance, Joe also developed his own business of life, accident, and the new automobile insurance.
I also served 6 years in the city council and made sure that the roads in the city were paved. They even gave me a nickname, Pavement Paxson. A thriving community needs good roads. The Algona Commercial Club was formed with my help. It promoted local businesses and resources in our community. Helen, you were busy too.
My most important endeavor was the founding of the NSDAR chapter in Algona in 1924. That stands for National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. My family had lived long enough in the United States that we had descended from a patriot. A patriot was a man or woman who with unfailing loyalty served as a sailor, soldier, civil officer, or rendered material aid to the cause of American independence during the American Revolution. I soon found several eligible women in our community and helped them prove they could join the DAR. When the National DAR had approved our chapter, we set up our bylaws and elected officers. I served as the first regent, the president of the fledgling organization from 1924 to 1929. Let me tell you a few of our many accomplishments. Over the years, the chapter has placed memorials important in the history of Kossuth County. Many of you have taken tours to Ambrose A. Call State Park and have discussed the location of the Call's first cabin near our town. Remember that boulder with the tablet? When Ambrose Call donated the land for the park in 1925, our chapter was only 1 year old, but we hurried to include a suitable monument to mark that first cabin when the park was dedicated in 1929. You guessed it, the boulder with the bronze tablet. The earliest school in Kossuth County was a dugout in the side of a hill on Black Cat Creek, dubbed Gopher College. In 1937, at the location of Gopher College on River Road, north of Algona, a monument was also erected there. A plaque had previously been placed at the location of the former Algona Stockade. The stockade was built after the Spirit Lake Massacre. In the late 1970s, the building located at 120 East State Street, where the plaque was mounted, burned. Our DAR chapter had the plaque reconditioned and placed on the new building as part of its 60th anniversary celebration in 1979. The most recent monument, thanks to a DAR daughter, the late Midge Andreessen, is located on the blacktop east of Burt. It tells about the last Native American battlefield in Kossuth County. After I served my term as regent, I was elected historian, holding that office for more than 20 years when my daughter-in-law, Mabel Paxson, replaced me. She earlier had become the 9th regent from 1943 to 45. Please notice the bronze DAR insignias at our graves. I may be boasting when I say that after I passed, the Algona Daughters still have a strong chapter continuing what I started as they celebrate their 100th anniversary next May in 2024. They have given many American history, citizenship, and good citizen awards for keeping our history alive to students and community members. The Daughters have supported and recognized veterans and promoted volunteerism.
Helen was such a party planner, and our calendar was filled with social events. We both enjoyed bridge and spent many evenings playing cards with friends. My friends knew I loved my pipes, and they gifted me several. Music and dancing were important to both of us. Helen helped the Methodist women plan a great New Year's Eve party in 1912. And I'm sorry that you couldn't attend. The women had a great big reception, and then we men went to 7 different homes for refreshments and entertainment, sometimes provided by us. We presented a silly little calling card at each stop as our admission ticket. I wonder if you folks are as creative today.
All good times must end, and our wonderful life together was drawing to a close. Joe was failing, but he still worked as the secretary at Kossuth Mutual with our son Dana assisting him. Finally, he resigned, and 2 days later, on January 13th, 1933, Joe died and was buried here. People wondered if I would ever recover after losing him.
I didn't want you to be sad, and you knew that. My dear girl continued as a member of the Congregational Church and was very active there. At her death, she was a 50-year member. Helen was always described as cheerful and fun-loving, and she enjoyed telling stories of her youth and her family. Helen was a great walker and would often walk from her apartment she later had at 404 South Harlan to church or to shop downtown. The Kershilla store honored her in an ad on her 97th birthday, saying that she was a loyal customer who bought a set of dishes from Theodore Kershilla's in the original store in 1878.
I was still up for a game of bridge or the new rage canasta into my 90s. 25 years after the loss of my Joe, and until a year before my death, there was a bug here, I'm sorry. Year before my death, I lived alone and cooked my own meals. But I did have a cleaning lady once a week. The only shadows in my life were the losses of my friends, my Joe, and both our sons, Elwood in 1949 and Dana in 1951. I think that all that dancing and walking kept me strong and healthy. Catherine was our only remaining child, and she lived in Mesa City. I did have 6 grandchildren, of whom I was very proud. One son is buried here with us that served in World War II. Finally, a year before I died, I engaged a room at the Roberts Nursing Home, the former Ambrose A. Call House on South Hall Street. As you can see on my gravestone, I died on December 23, 1958. I was 99 years, 8 months, and 2 days young, the second oldest living person in Algona.